The car stopped on a winding mountain road just outside a quiet town in Colorado, where the mist hung low between the pine trees, like it was reluctant to let go. You could hear the river in the distance, a constant, gentle rushing that seemed to be holding its breath. My breath fogged the passenger window as I sat there, confused and heartbroken. Welcome to her light, where we illuminate the stories that matter most to women finding their strength. Have you ever felt abandoned by those you loved most? Share your experience in the comments. Your courage might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. My son David, my only child, stared straight ahead through the windshield. His fingers drummed impatiently on the steering wheel, like he was waiting for a traffic light to change. He wouldn't look at me, wouldn't meet my eyes even for a moment. When his voice finally came, it was too calm, too detached. "This is where you get off, Mom." You probably cannot imagine that kind of sentence, unless you have already lost so much. There is barely anything left to take. I laughed at first. Of course I laughed. I thought he was making some kind of terrible joke. Who does that? Who drives their 72-year-old mother, who just buried her husband of 45 years, only 5 days ago, out to the middle of nowhere, and tells her to get out? I was wearing Walter's old house shoes, brown leather slippers that had molded to his feet over the decades. I had been shuffling around in them since the funeral, unable to bring myself to put on real shoes. They were too big, sliding off my heels with every step, but somehow wearing them made me feel like he was still protecting me, still keeping me grounded. "You are serious?" I asked, my voice light and testing, like maybe we were still pretending this was some kind of misunderstanding. That is when he turned to look at me, and that is when I knew. His eyes were flat, empty of any warmth I remembered from the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. He handed me my purse, like he was delivering a package to a stranger. "The house and the bakery are mine now," he said matter-of-factly. Nicole's already having the locks changed. Nicole, his wife, with her practiced smile, and that soft, condescending tone that made everything sound like both a blessing and a threat. I blinked hard, hoping the mountain road would shift back into something familiar, hoping he had break into that crooked grin and tell me it was all a mistake, a cruel joke that had gone too far. But he didn't. My door was already open. My slippers hit the gravel, and before I could catch my breath or form another word, the car was backing up, turning around. "This is insane," I said, but my voice didn't even shake. It was too quiet for shock, too hollow for rage. "You cannot just." "I am your mother, David," he didn't answer, just called over his shoulder as he drove away. "You will figure it out. You always do." And then he was gone. No suitcase, no phone, no plan, just a purse, a light jacket, and the sound of tires on wet asphalt fading into the mountain's silence. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood there on that empty road, back straight and spine rigid, while the evening mist pressed against me like it was trying to memorize my shape. I watched his taillights disappear around the bend, taking with them 45 years of a life I had helped build from nothing. But here is what my son never understood. He didn't abandon me on that road. He set me free. He thought he was discarding me like yesterday's newspaper. What he really did was open a door to a life he didn't even know was possible. Because David had no idea what I had already done before his father died. We buried Walter just 5 days earlier. I remember almost nothing from the funeral, except how my heels kept sinking into the soft cemetery grass, and how David wouldn't look at me throughout the entire service. Nicole clung to his arm like ivy choking a fence post, and I remember her leaning close to the pastor, stage whispering just loud enough for me to hear. "She is not thinking clearly. It is the grief, you understand. She is not making rational decisions anymore." At the time, I thought she was trying to be protective, trying to shield me from having to make difficult choices while I was mourning. But standing there in that mountain mist, I realized what that moment really was. It was the opening move in a carefully planned takeover. Walter had trusted David with the hospice paperwork during those final weeks. I didn't want to burden my son during such a difficult time, that is what I told myself. He had enough stress managing his own family and his job. All I wanted was to give Walter dignity and peace in his last days. But somewhere between the medical forms and the insurance claims, something else had been slipped in. Documents with my signature that I didn't remember signing, powers of attorney that I never agreed to, forms that transferred control of everything Walter and I had built together. I didn't know the full scope of it yet, standing there on that road, but I knew enough to feel the cold sickness blooming in my chest like ice spreading through my veins. This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft of everything that mattered to me. My husband, my home, my voice. The bakery Walter and I had built from scratch, starting with nothing but a used commercial oven and a dream of serving fresh bread to our community. The place that had sustained us for 30 years, that had put David through college, that had been our legacy. David had always been clever, even as a little boy finding loopholes in every rule. But that cleverness had grown sharp edges when he married Nicole. That woman could weaponize politeness, could make cruelty sound like concern. I started walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stand still. Not in that mist, not in those oversized slippers, not with the weight of betrayal settling on my shoulders like lead. My knees ached, and my mouth was dry. But I walked past dripping evergreens, past moss, covered boulders, past the ghosts of every sacrifice I had made, so my son could grow up strong and independent. Around mile 3, something settled over me, something quiet but firm, like steel wrapped in silk. They thought they had won. They thought I was weak, disposable, a problem they could simply drive away and forget. But they had forgotten something crucial. I still had Walter's lockbox key. I still had access to the safe deposit box at First Mountain Bank. And most importantly, I still had my name on the original business license for Hartwell's Bakery. I was not dead yet, and I was far from finished. The mist clung to me like perspiration as I walked those mountain roads. My legs burned, and my breath came in short puffs, but I didn't stop, not because I wasn't tired, God knows I was exhausted, but because if I stopped moving, I would have to think, and if I really thought about what had just happened, I would shatter into pieces too small to ever put back together. I passed under a streetlight where a small owl watched me from the power lines above, its golden eyes reflecting the lamplight like it understood something. I was only beginning to grasp. I remembered the little notes I used to pack in David's lunchbox when he was small. You are brave. You are kind. Mommy loves you. I used to cut his sandwiches into the shapes of dinosaurs and airplanes. I would read 3 stories every night, even when my eyes burned with exhaustion from 12 hard days at the bakery. I taught him to ride a bike, holding the seat steady until he was ready to fly on his own. I sat through every Little League game, cheering from the bleachers, even when he struck out. When he had nightmares about monsters under his bed, I would check every corner of his room and leave his closet light on all night. And now I was roadside garbage to him, that boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, who would curl up against me during thunderstorms. He was gone, replaced by a man who could abandon his own mother without a backward glance. I don't remember exactly how many miles I walked that night. Maybe 5, maybe 7, but when I saw the flickering neon sign for Murphy's General Store, my legs nearly gave out with relief. Mrs. Murphy had been running that little shop since I was a young woman. She used to stock penny candy and local newspapers. Now she sold organic coffee and artisanal dog treats. I pushed open the door, and the bell gave a half-hearted jingle. Mrs. Murphy looked up from her reading glasses, and her face immediately creased with worry. "Margaret," she said, her voice sharp with concern. "You look like hell warmed over." "I feel like it," I replied, my lips too cold to manage a real smile. She didn't hesitate, just came around the counter and wrapped me in her arms before I could protest. Her embrace smelled like lavender soap and kindness. "What on earth happened to you?" I looked down at Walter's slippers on my feet, at the gravel dust on my jacket. I have been walking. Walking from where? The Summit Junction. Her eyes went wide. That is nearly 8 miles, Margaret, in those shoes. 6 and change, I corrected quietly. She sat me down immediately, wrapped me in a fleece blanket that smelled like fabric softener and hope, and put a steaming cup of coffee in my hands. The warmth spread through my fingers like salvation. "Where is David?" she asked gently. My throat closed. "Gone," she froze, studying my face. "What do you mean, gone?" I couldn't answer. "Not yet." The kindness in her voice was threatening to break open. The dam I had built around my emotions, and I wasn't ready for that flood. She didn't press, just said, "Rest now. I will make you a sandwich." And I sat there, wrapped in borrowed warmth with blistered feet and bleeding pride, with one sentence echoing in my head like a prayer. What is love without respect? Mrs. Murphy brought me a turkey sandwich cut diagonally, the way my own mother used to do when I was small. She didn't ask if I was hungry, she just handed it to me like that was the next logical step in keeping someone from falling apart completely. I took a bite before I could think about it. The coffee had grown lukewarm, but it tasted more like safety than caffeine. And as I sat there in that little store, wrapped in that fleece blanket that smelled faintly of other people's kindness, something shifted inside me, something subtle, like a knot in my chest loosening just slightly. What is love without respect? I used to think love was the foundation, something solid that could weather any storm. But foundations can crack. They can crumble under enough pressure. Respect, that is what builds the walls that keep love safe. That is what creates the space for love to grow instead of suffocate. And I had loved David fiercely, completely, the way mothers are supposed to love their children. But somewhere along the way, I had let him stop respecting me. I had let Nicole's subtle undermining, and her so gentle suggestions about my age and my capabilities wear me down like water on stone. I had let them take over Walter's medical decisions without asking where the bills were going. I had told myself it was flexibility, trust, letting them help during a difficult time, but it wasn't help. It was surrender. And sitting there in that general store, with my feet aching and my heart bleeding, I finally saw it for what it really was. I hadn't been generous or understanding. I had been groomed for this moment, prepared for disposal like a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. Mrs. Murphy offered to drive me anywhere I needed to go. I told her no. Thank you, I wasn't ready for that kind of rescue yet. I called a taxi from her old rotary phone, paid cash from the emergency fund Walter had always insisted I carry in my purse. A woman should never be caught without options, he used to say. Funny how that advice seemed prophetic now. The taxi driver didn't ask questions, just took me up the mountain highway to a small motor lodge with flickering neon and an ice machine that hummed off. Key, the kind of place where long-haul truckers stopped when the weather turned bad. Not charming or cozy, but anonymous. And that is exactly what I needed. I paid cash, signed a false name on the register, and carried my purse against my chest like it could shield me from the cold. When I stepped into the small room, it smelled like industrial disinfectant and wood paneling that had seen better decades. The comforter was polyester. The light above the nightstand buzzed like a dying insect. I didn't care. I stood in the middle of that unremarkable room, let my purse slide to the floor, and whispered aloud for the first time since the funeral. You were right, Walter. And then, quieter, like I was speaking to the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. I should have seen this coming. The next morning, I sat on the edge of that stiff motel bed, wrapped in one of those thin hotel towels, my fingers curled around a lukewarm cup of coffee from the lobby. My bones ached, but it wasn't just from the long walk the night before. I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't touch. And that is when a memory came to me. Uninvited, but not unwelcome. Walter and I, our first spring at the bakery. The building had been a disaster when we bought it, a former auto repair shop with oil stains on the concrete floor and walls that needed everything. We spent months scrubbing, painting, installing equipment with our own hands. I remembered the day we put up our first sign, Hartwell's Bakery fresh daily. Walter had insisted on painting it himself, even though his hands weren't as steady as they used to be. David was young, then maybe 9 years old, running around the empty shop, his laughter echoing off the bare walls. It had been a good day, a perfect day, if I am being honest, full of hope and possibility, and the kind of exhausted satisfaction that comes from building something with your own hands. And now, here I was, sitting in a motel room that looked like it had forgotten what decade it was built in, remembering how we used to dream together. Walter always said the bakery wasn't just about bread and pastries, it was about creating a place where the community could gather, where the smell of fresh baking could make anyone feel like they were coming home. The fog hadn't lifted outside my window, still heavy and gray like breath on glass. But there was more light now, a subtle shift in the darkness. Not hope exactly, but something, a sense that this wasn't an ending. It was a pause before something new began. I found a takeout menu in the nightstand drawer, along with a Gideon Bible and a book of matches from a local auto shop. I didn't need any of these things, but I held them anyway, trying to remember the last time I had felt this anonymous, this free from other people's expectations. I had spent 4 decades of my life as the face of Hartwell's Bakery, greeting customers before dawn, mixing dough while the rest of the town slept, decorating cakes for celebrations I wasn't always invited to attend, always in motion, always needed, always defined by what I could provide for others. Now, stillness, and the silence wasn't empty or lonely. It was patient, like it had been waiting for me to stop running long enough to listen. Later that afternoon, I walked again. Slower this time, more deliberate. There was a small park just down the road from the motel half. Dead grass, 2 picnic tables, and a swing set that looked like it had given up trying to bring joy to children. A young mother was there, struggling to get her toddler into a puffy winter coat while the child squirmed and protested. She looked bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion I remembered from David's early years. I used to sing him lullabies I made up on the spot. Songs about brave little boys and magical bakeries where the bread never ran out and everyone always had enough. He would curl against me, his small fingers tangled in my hair, trusting completely that I could fix whatever was wrong in his world. Where had that boy gone? When had he been replaced by a man who could throw away his own mother, like she was nothing more than an inconvenience? Back in the motel room, I found my journal buried deep in my purse, a leather-bound book Walter had given me for Christmas 2 years ago. It still smelled like cedar and possibility. I flipped through the pages until I found the last thing he had written, a sticky note tucked between the blank sheets. Don't let them push you aside. Remember who you are. Remember what you built. His handwriting was shaky but determined, written during one of his clearer moments near the end. And just like that, it felt like a flare shot into the darkness he had known. Even as he was dying, he had seen what was coming. Maybe I had seen it too, but I hadn't wanted to name it, hadn't wanted to believe that my own son could be capable of such calculated cruelty. But now it had a name, betrayal, and it had a face. David's that night. I didn't cry, but I did lie in that motel bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere I had never been, and I whispered to the darkness, I miss you, Walter, but I think I am finally ready to do what you told me to do, because it hadn't been just one moment that warned me. It had been hundreds of small moments, soft and subtle, easy to overlook if you were trying hard to believe in love and family loyalty. The way David had stopped calling unless something needed to be fixed or decided. The way Nicole would say you must be so tired, like it was a gentle observation when it was really a leash, a way of suggesting I should step back, sit down, let the younger generation handle things. The way she had stopped calling me Mom and started using my first name, Margaret, like I was a neighbor or an acquaintance instead of the woman who had raised her husband. The name change had hurt more than I ever admitted. Not because it was openly hostile, but because it was so deliberately distancing, so intentionally cold. Thanksgiving, the last one before Walter's diagnosis. I had brought out my grandmother's china, delicate white plates with tiny blue flowers around the rim. Nicole had looked at them and said, "Maybe next year we should just use paper plates. It would be so much easier for you, Margaret." I had laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. That night, David had told me I had made too much food, that it made Nicole feel pressured to eat more than she wanted, pressured by mashed potatoes and green bean casserole, by the apple pie I had been making for Thanksgiving since before he was born. I had made Nicole's favorite sweet potato casserole that year. She barely touched it, and the next Christmas, she bought cookies still in their plastic container, like she couldn't be bothered to even transfer them to a proper serving plate. I said thank you. I said it with a smile, because I was still pretending that everything was normal, that families just naturally evolved and changed, that love could survive any amount of disrespect if you were patient enough and understanding enough. Not anymore. The night after I found Walter's note, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid that initial shock had burned away like morning fog. I was restless in a different way, like something crucial had finally clicked into place, like my bones were remembering they still belonged to me. I stared at that motel ceiling, heart beating slow and steady, and I started making a list in my head. Not a list of heartbreaks or grievances, but a list of evidence, because people love to talk about betrayal like it is a sudden slap across the face, a shocking moment of violence. But my betrayal had come like water rising in a basement, inch by inch, so slowly, you don't notice until you look down and realize you are drowning. I started with the last time David had offered to help with something. It was after Walter's cancer diagnosis, stage 2 pancreatic cancer. The doctor had said, treatable but serious. I was overwhelmed with medical appointments, insurance forms, and the crushing weight of watching the man I loved slowly fade away. David had stepped in with that warm, concerned smile. "Let me handle the paperwork, Mom. Let me organize the bills and keep track of everything. You just focus on taking care of Dad." He had looked so sincere, so genuinely helpful. I had wanted desperately to believe it was love, that my son was finally stepping up to support his parents in their time of need. But the hospice invoices didn't match what our insurance was supposed to cover. The bank statements showed payments I didn't remember authorizing. When I asked about the discrepancies, David would smile and wave away my concerns. "Don't worry about it, Mom. It is all taken care of. You have enough to stress about, and it was taken care of, just not in the way I had assumed." Nicole used to invite me for coffee every week. That stopped gradually. First, it became we are running errands. Today, or the kids are napping, or now's really not a good time. So I started calling first, asking permission to visit my own son and grandchildren. Then I was told to call ahead every time. Then they started saying they would come to me instead. And then they stopped coming altogether. From weekly visits to every other week. From every other week to maybe once a month. From monthly to we will call you. I adjusted every time. I bent and accommodated and made excuses for them until I realized I was the only one doing any adjusting at all. The week after Walter's funeral, I had asked David if he wanted to go through his father's workshop together. Walter's tools were still arranged exactly as he had left them. His reading glasses on the workbench next to a half-finished birdhouse. The pocket notebook where he kept measurements and sketches for his woodworking projects. David had brushed off the suggestion, "Too busy right now, Mom. Nicole and I have a lot on our plates." Nicole had just smiled and said, "Don't worry, Margaret, we will take care of all that eventually. Take care of it." Like Walter's lifetime of careful craftsmanship was just clutter to be cleared away. Like 45 years of marriage could be sorted and disposed of, like old newspapers. And I had nodded, like a fool, like a woman who had forgotten she had any right to her own husband's memory. But the worst part, the detail that had nearly shattered what was left of my composure, was the business cards. I found them in a box on the bakery's front counter the day after Walter's funeral. New cards, glossy and expensive, with a redesigned logo. The old logo had been simple. Hartwell's Bakery in cheerful blue letters with a small illustration of a wheat sheaf. Walter had drawn that wheat sheaf himself, said it represented growth and nourishment, and the simple pleasure of honest work. The new cards had a sleek, minimalist design, just Hartwell's in elegant script, no wheat sheaf, no indication that this was a place built by two people who had poured their hearts into every loaf of bread and birthday cake. David's name was listed as owner and manager. Nicole's name was there too, as creative director. My name was nowhere to be found, not even founder or co-owner, just erased, like I had never existed. I had stood there in my own bakery, holding those cards like they were death certificates, and still I hadn't said anything. I had gone into the kitchen and started cleaning counters that were already spotless, playing the role of helpful background staff in the business I had helped create. That night in the motel, I pulled out a small notebook from my purse, one I had used to track inventory and supplier deliveries, and I wrote down every moment I had swallowed my questions, every time I had let something slide, every instance when I had pretended their silence was stress instead of strategy. 4 full pages, not complaints, but evidence. Documentation of a systematic campaign to erase me from my own life. People talk about the frog in slowly boiling water, how it doesn't realize it is being cooked until it is too late. I had been that frog, and David and Nicole had turned up the heat 1 degree at a time. One small cruelty disguised as concern until I was too weak to jump out of the pot. But I wasn't dead yet. And I was finally awake. The next morning, I made a phone call I had been avoiding for months. My niece Linda, she was 35, maybe 36, with 2 teenagers and a husband who sold insurance in Denver. We weren't particularly close family gatherings, maybe twice a year. Christmas cards with generic messages, but she had sent flowers when Walter passed. A beautiful arrangement with a card that said, "Thinking of you. Please let me know if you need anything," so I called. It rang 5 times before she answered. "Hello, Linda, it is Aunt Margaret." A pause. A subtle shift in tone. "Oh, hi, it has been a while. How are you holding up?" That pause. That careful distance. It settled in my stomach like a stone. "I am managing. Actually, I could use a favor." "Nothing major." Oh, her voice became tighter, more guarded. "What kind of favor?" "I need somewhere to stay for a few days, just temporarily, while I figure some things out." "Stay here?" I could hear dishes clattering in the background, the sound of a busy household continuing its routine, while I asked for help. "Aunt Margaret, it is not that I don't want to help. It is just, things are really hectic right now. Tyler has basketball. Sarah's got drama club, and we are dealing with some work stuff." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "I understand. Have you talked to David? I am sure he could help you with whatever's going on." There it was, the assumption that I should go back to the person who had abandoned me and ask for rescue. The belief that family problems could always be smoothed over with a little communication. "And understanding it is complicated," I said. "I am sure it is just a misunderstanding," Linda said gently. "You know how grief can make everything feel more intense than it really is." I made one more attempt, called Walter's brother, Richard, in Phoenix. Same conversation, different words, expressions of sympathy followed by gentle suggestions that I should work things out with David. That family was family, that surely whatever had happened could be resolved with patience and forgiveness. Nobody wanted to hear that sometimes families break in ways that cannot be repaired. Nobody wanted to acknowledge that love without respect is just a pretty word for manipulation. So I was alone, truly alone for the first time in my adult life. And surprisingly, that realization didn't terrify me. It clarified me. I walked to a small diner down the mountain road from the motel, one of those places with vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone honey without irony. The coffee was strong, the pie was homemade, and nobody looked at me like I needed to be fixed or managed or handled with extra care. The waitress, A woman about my age with silver hair and kind eyes brought me coffee without being asked. She didn't hover or ask probing questions about why I was staying at the motel. She just kept my cup full and let me sit in peace. Back in the motel room, I sat on that uncomfortable bed and stared at the ceiling fan spinning in slow, lazy circles. Everyone wanted me to rest, to step back, to let others handle the difficult decisions. So I would rest. I would wait. And when the time was right, I would wake up with a plan that none of them would see coming. Because the difference between heartbreak and strategy is simply a matter of what you do with the silence. 2 days passed in that motel room. Long, quiet days where time seemed to move sideways instead of forward. I didn't cry or rage or make frantic phone calls. I planned, because I had learned something important about myself during those 48 hours of solitude. I was much stronger than anyone had given me credit for, including myself. On the third morning, I walked into town and stopped at the public library. The librarian was a stern-looking woman who probably could have tracked down overdue books by scent alone. But she smiled warmly when I asked for a guest computer pass. "Research project?" she asked, sliding the clipboard across the desk. "Something like that," I said. I sat at a public computer that looked like it belonged in a museum and got to work. First, I accessed the county clerk's website and searched for property records. I typed in our home address, heart pounding harder than it should have. There it was, Walter Hartwell and Margaret Hartwell. Joint owners. My name was still there, still legally recognized. David and Nicole had been bluffing about changing the locks. They had no legal authority to exclude me from my own home. Next, I logged into the bank account Walter and I had opened for bakery renovations. We had never used it, there was never enough extra money for improvements. But Walter had insisted on keeping it active just in case we ever needed emergency funds. The balance made me laugh out loud in that quiet library, $43,847. 63. Walter, you secretive old fox. He had been quietly setting aside money for years, probably skimming small amounts from the bakery's profits and depositing them in an account only we knew about. David and Nicole had no idea this money existed. They thought I was financially dependent on their generosity, helpless without their support. They were wrong. I printed out the property records and bank statements, highlighting my name on every page like I was preparing for trial. Because in a way, I was building a case for my own right to exist, to matter, to take up space in the world I had helped create. That afternoon, I made a phone call to someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Betty Chen, a local reporter who had covered community events for the Mountain View Herald before the paper folded. She was sharp as a razor, had always carried a camera, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to smell corruption. I remembered her pulling me aside at Walter's memorial service. "Margaret," she had said, "if those two start making moves on the bakery before you are ready, you call me. I have seen this pattern before, and it never ends well for the widow." I had thought she was being dramatic. Turns out she was just early. She agreed to meet me at the diner where I had been having my meals. Same vinyl booth, same patient waitress, same strong coffee that tasted like possibility. Betty slid into the seat across from me, still wearing that cracked leather jacket she had owned since the 1990s. Her gray hair was pulled back with a pencil, and her eyes were already sharp with curiosity. "Tell me everything," she said without preamble. So I did. Not all at once, not with tears or dramatics. I told it like a story, scene by scene. David stopping the car, the mist on the mountain road, the cold door slam, the motel room, the phone calls that led nowhere, the silence that spoke louder than words. When I showed her the printouts, the property deed, the bank records, the evidence of my legal standing, she let out a low whistle. "Well," she said, leaning back in the booth, "they picked the wrong old woman to mess with." I smiled. It was my first real smile in days. "Think you can help me?" She grinned back. "Margaret, I have been waiting for someone to expose this town's ugly underbelly for years. This is exactly the kind of story that needs telling. We made a plan, Not a lawsuit, not yet. Something quieter, smarter, something Nicole wouldn't see coming. Betty helped me draft a letter, professional, legally sound, impossible to misinterpret, to whom it may concern, as co-owner and named party on the deed to the property. Located at 1247 Pine Street and as co-founder of Hartwell's Bakery, I am formally notifying all involved parties that any changes to the business operations, property modifications, or transfer of ownership without my explicit written consent will be considered a breach of contract and subject to legal action. Sincerely, Margaret Hartwell. Simple, clear. A reminder that I hadn't disappeared, that I still had legal standing, that I was not as helpless as they had assumed. We made copies and mailed them to David Nicole, their business email address, and their lawyer because of course they had retained a lawyer. Then we waited 3 days later. I received a response, not from David, from Nicole, typed on letterhead that bore the updated Hartwell's logo, the one without the wheat sheaf Walter had drawn. Dear Margaret, we are disappointed that you have chosen to pursue this adversarial approach, especially during such an emotionally difficult time for everyone involved. However, we respect your position and will comply with your request pending further discussion. Please let us know how you wish to proceed. Best regards, Nicole Hartwell, Creative Director. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done. Just a carefully worded warning dressed up as professional courtesy. But buried in that corporate language was something important. They were backing down. For now, what Nicole didn't know was that I had been planning my next move while she was composing her diplomatic response, because I remembered something she had forgotten in her rush to rebrand and modernize. Hartwell's Bakery wasn't built on fancy logos or marketing strategies. It was built on relationships, on 30 years of wedding cakes and birthday parties, of fresh bread that brought people together, of personal connections that couldn't be copyrighted or trademarked. So I created a new email address and started reaching out to our longtime customers, not to complain or ask for sympathy, but to reconnect. Dear friends of Hartwell's Bakery, you may have noticed some changes at the bakery recently. I wanted to reach out personally to thank you for 30 years of loyalty, for trusting us with your celebrations and your everyday needs. I may not be behind the counter anymore, but I will always be grateful for your friendship and support. With love and appreciation, Margaret Hartwell. The responses started coming within hours. Some were short and sweet. We miss you. The cinnamon rolls aren't the same. We always knew something felt different. Others were longer, more detailed. One came from the Martinez family, who had ordered their daughter's Quincia-era cake from us 5 years earlier. Mrs. Hartwell, we were so confused when we went in last week and you weren't there. Nicole said you had retired, but that didn't feel right. You don't seem like someone who would just stop doing what she loves. We hope you are well, and we want you to know that cake you made for Sophia's party is still talked about at family gatherings. You made that day special for all of us. I read that message 3 times, then read it again. These people had seen me. They had valued what I brought to their lives, and they had noticed when it disappeared. By the end of the week, I had received 47 responses. Each one a reminder that my life's work had mattered, that I had created something real and meaningful that couldn't be erased by new business cards or logo redesigns. It was time to take the next step. I packed my single suitcase and checked out of the motel. But instead of going back down the mountain toward my old life, I drove further up toward the small ski town of Pine Ridge, where Walter and I had once talked about opening a second location. It had been just a dream then. Something we discussed over coffee and newspaper comics on Sunday mornings. But I remembered what we had imagined. A small place, cozy and warm, where locals could gather for fresh coffee and homemade pastries. We had even talked about calling it Second Rise, a baking pun that made us both laugh. The town was exactly as I remembered it. 2 bookstores, a coffee shop with a hand-painted sign, and a main street lined with small businesses that looked like they were owned by people who cared more about community than profit. I spent the day walking up and down that main street, notebook in hand, writing down addresses of empty storefronts. Nothing fancy or large, just spaces with good light and enough room for a small kitchen and a few tables where people could sit and talk. By the end of the week, I had found it. A small corner building with big windows and good bones. The previous tenant had been a gift shop that couldn't survive the economic downturn. The rent was reasonable, and the landlord was a woman my age who understood what it meant to start over. I stood in the middle of that empty space, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight, and whispered, "We are doing it, Walter." Just like we always talked about. No answer, of course, but I swear the breeze through the cracked front door smelled like possibility. The first month was harder than I had expected. Not emotionally, I had made peace with the isolation, but physically, the work of transforming an empty shell into a functioning bakery was exhausting for a 72-year-old woman working mostly alone. I started small, cleaned every surface, painted the walls a warm yellow that reminded me of butter and sunshine. I bought used equipment from restaurant supply companies, basic ovens and mixers that would let me produce small batches of bread and pastries. Every morning before dawn, I would arrive at my little bakery and begin the familiar ritual, measuring flour, kneading dough, watching the alchemy of ingredients transform into something nourishing and beautiful. The work felt like coming home to myself. My first customer was a construction worker who knocked on the door before I had even put up my open sign. He had smelled the bread baking and wondered if he could buy a loaf for his lunch. I wrapped it in brown paper and sold it to him for $3. And when he took that first bite, his eyes closed with pleasure. "That," he said, "tastes like my grandmother's kitchen." Word spread slowly but steadily. People began stopping by on their way to work, drawn by the smell of fresh baking and the sight of lights on before sunrise. I kept things simple: basic breads, classic muffins, coffee that was strong and hot, but I also did something Nicole never would have thought to do. I remembered names. I asked about families and jobs and celebrations. I made birthday cakes on request and donated day-old bread to the local food bank. I turned my little bakery into what Walter and I had always intended, a place where community could happen. 3 months after I opened, a local food blogger wrote a review that changed everything. She wrote about finding the most authentic bakery experience in the mountains and described how the owner treats every customer like family in the best possible way. The review went viral on social media. Suddenly I had customers driving up from Denver on weekends, tourists stopping by during ski season, and a waiting list for custom wedding cakes. But the best part was the regular customers. The locals who had made second rise part of their daily routine. They would sit at my small tables, reading newspapers, and catching up with neighbors. While I worked behind the counter, it felt like the bakery Walter and I had always dreamed of creating. Meanwhile, word filtered back to me about what was happening at the original Hartwell's bakery. Business was declining. Customers complained that the atmosphere felt cold and impersonal. Several long-time clients had specifically asked for me and been told I was no longer available. David had tried to hire experienced bakers, but none of them could replicate the recipes that had taken me 30 years to perfect. Nicole had focused on rebranding and social media marketing. But you cannot Instagram your way to authentic flavor and genuine warmth. I didn't gloat. There was no satisfaction in their struggles, only sadness that something beautiful had been destroyed by greed and short-sightedness. One evening, Betty drove up to Pine Ridge to check on me. She brought a box of newspaper clippings, reviews of Second Rise, mentions in tourism guides, photographs of customers enjoying my pastries. She also brought gossip. "David came by the Herald office last week," she said, sipping coffee at one of my small tables. "He wanted to place an ad for experienced bakers. When I asked how business was going, he got defensive, said there were just some adjustments happening, and Nicole, haven't seen her. But I heard she has been trying to sell the original bakery equipment. Apparently, they are downsizing." I felt a pang of something. Not regret exactly, but recognition. They were learning what Walter and I had always known. A bakery isn't just a business. It is a relationship with the community, built one loaf of bread and one satisfied customer at a time. That relationship couldn't be transferred or rebranded or managed by someone who had never understood its value in the first place. 6 months after opening Second Rise, I received an envelope with no return address. The handwriting on the front was familiar, David's careful script from childhood. Thank you notes and school assignments. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Mom, I don't know how to start this. I don't even know if you will read it. I have been driving by your new place, and I see how busy you are, how happy you look. I know I don't deserve to ask, but I miss you. I miss talking to you. I miss being your son instead of just someone who disappointed you. I am sorry. I am so sorry for everything, David. I sat in my empty bakery after closing, holding that letter and remembering the little boy who used to help me measure ingredients for cookies, who would stand on a step stool beside me and carefully crack eggs into the mixing bowl. That boy was still there somewhere, buried under years of poor choices and worse influences. But an apology wasn't enough to rebuild what had been destroyed. Trust, once broken, requires more than words to repair. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer, along with Walter's notebook and the first review of Second Rise. Evidence of my journey from abandonment to independence, from heartbreak to healing. I didn't write back, not yet. Because forgiveness isn't a light switch you can flip whenever someone asks for it. It is a bridge that has to be built slowly, carefully, with both people working from their own side. David would have to prove he understood what he had done, what he had lost, and who he wanted to become. Until then, I had my own life to build. And what a life it was becoming. Second Rise had grown beyond anything I had imagined. I had hired 2 part-time employees, local women who understood that baking was about more than just following recipes. We were producing wedding cakes, catering small events, and shipping our signature sourdough bread to customers across Colorado. But more than the business success, I had rebuilt something I thought was lost forever. A sense of purpose, of belonging, of mattering to people who valued what I had to offer. I woke up every morning eager to start the day, excited to see which regular customers would stop by, curious about what new challenges and opportunities would present themselves. I was living instead of just surviving, thriving instead of just enduring. One snowy morning in February, a woman came into the bakery carrying a small bundle wrapped in pink blankets. She was young, maybe 25, with the exhausted but glowing look of a new mother. I heard this was the place that makes the best coffee cake in the mountains, she said, shifting the bundle to one arm. That depends on what kind you are looking for, I replied, coming around the counter to admire the baby. What is the occasion? My mom's birthday. She has been helping with the baby, and I wanted to do something special for her. I spent 15 minutes asking about her mother's preferences, suggesting different flavors and presentation options. In the end, we decided on a classic cinnamon coffee cake with a handwritten note on the box. As I was packaging the cake, the young woman said, "You know, this feels different from other bakeries. More personal, I guess. That is because every cake that leaves here carries a story," I told her. "Your story, your mother's story, the story of your new family. Food is love, made visible." She smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. That is exactly what my grandmother used to say. After she left, I stood in my warm bakery, surrounded by the smell of yeast and cinnamon and possibility, and realized something profound. I was home, not just in a physical sense, but in every way that mattered. This wasn't just a business I had built to survive abandonment. It was a life I had created to honor everything I had learned about resilience, community, and the simple power of showing up for people when they needed something nourishing. The phone rang, interrupting my reverie. The caller ID showed David's number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message while I cleaned the morning's mixing bowls. "Hi, Mom. I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I wanted you to know that Nicole and I are getting divorced. She is moving back to California, and, well, the bakery is closing. I wanted you to hear it from me, instead of from someone else. I hope you are well. I love you." I played the message twice, trying to parse the emotions in his voice. Sadness, certainly, regret, but also something that might have been relief. I didn't call him back, but I did pull out a fresh sheet of paper and write a short note. "David, I received your message. I am sorry. Your marriage is ending. Divorce is painful, even when it is necessary. I want you to know that I am well and happy. When you are ready to talk about rebuilding trust, instead of just apologizing for breaking it, I will be here. Love, Mom." I mailed it the next day, along with a small loaf of his favorite bread from childhood honey wheat, with sunflower seeds, not because I had forgiven him, but because he was still my son, and sometimes love means offering nourishment even to people who have hurt you. The months that followed brought changes I hadn't expected. David began stopping by Second Rise occasionally, not to talk, but just to order coffee and sit quietly at a corner table. We didn't speak beyond basic customer interactions, but I could see him watching me work, observing how I interacted with customers, beginning to understand what he had thrown away. Nicole left town without saying goodbye to anyone. The original Hartwell's bakery building was put up for sale, then rent, then finally sold to a young couple who planned to turn it into an antique shop. Meanwhile, Second Rise continued to grow. I was featured in a regional magazine's article about women entrepreneurs over 60. A food television show asked to film a segment about traditional baking techniques. The mayor of Pine Ridge presented me with a key to the city for contributing to the economic and cultural vitality of our community. But the recognition that meant the most came from my customers. The thank you cards and handwritten notes. The families who made Second Rise part of their weekly routine. The couples who chose my cakes for their weddings, because they wanted something made with love instead of just profit. One evening, as I was closing up the bakery, David appeared at the front door. He looked thinner than I remembered. Older, worn down by the consequences of his choices. "Could we talk?" he asked, through the glass. I unlocked the door and let him in, but I didn't turn on the overhead lights. The space felt safer in the dim glow of the display case lighting, more intimate but less vulnerable. "I have been coming here for months," he said, taking off his coat, "but not sitting down, watching you work, seeing how people respond to you. And I finally understand what I destroyed." I waited. I had learned the power of silence, of letting people fill the quiet with truth, instead of rushing to make them comfortable. "It wasn't just a business," he continued. "It was your calling, your way of taking care of people, and I took that away from you because I thought I knew better. Because Nicole convinced me that sentiment was weakness, and that modernizing meant erasing everything that came before." He sat down heavily at one of my small tables, the same tables where families gathered every morning, where friendships were strengthened over coffee and pastries. "I don't know how to fix what I broke," he said. "I don't even know if it can be fixed. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see you, and I am so sorry. It took losing everything for me to remember who you are." I poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot I always kept warm for late customers, added cream to his, the way he had liked it since he was old enough to drink coffee. Saturday across from him at the table like we were customers instead of family. People instead of roles. "David," I said gently, "I need you to understand something. I am not the same person I was when you drove me up that mountain road. I am not your mother, who will sacrifice anything to keep peace in the family. I am not the woman who will accept disrespect because it is wrapped in politeness." He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. "I am someone who knows her own worth. Now," I continued, "someone who will not make herself smaller to fit into other people's idea of who she should be. If you want a relationship with me, it has to be based on that understanding. I want that," he said quietly. "I want to know who you have become. I want to earn the right to be part of your life again." We talked for 2 hours that night. Not about forgiveness or reconciliation, but about boundaries and expectations and the slow work of rebuilding trust. When he left, we didn't hug or make promises about the future. But we had begun something new, a relationship between two adults who respected each other instead of playing the roles of dutiful son and self-sacrificing mother. The process wasn't linear or easy. There were setbacks and misunderstandings, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves. But gradually, carefully, we built something neither of us had expected. An honest relationship based on mutual respect instead of obligation. David started working part-time at Second Rise. Not because I needed the help, but because he wanted to understand what he had missed. What kind of legacy he had been so eager to abandon. He learned to make bread from scratch, to interact with customers as human beings instead of transactions, to find satisfaction in work that served others instead of just himself. 1 year after that first conversation in my darkened bakery, David brought his new girlfriend to meet me. She was nothing like Nicole, warm instead of calculating, genuinely interested in other people instead of focused on her own image. When I offered to make their engagement cake, she cried with happiness. "I cannot believe you trust me with something so important," she said. "Trust is earned," I replied, smiling at David. "And some people work harder to earn it than others." The wedding cake I made for them was simple but beautiful, 3 layers of vanilla cake, with fresh strawberries and cream, decorated with real flowers from my garden. At the reception, David stood up to make a toast. "I want to thank my mother," he said, his voice carrying across the room filled with friends and family, "not just for this incredible cake, but for showing me what it means to start over, to build something beautiful from nothing, to never give up on the possibility of becoming better than you were." He raised his glass toward me. "To Margaret Hartwell, who taught me that family isn't about blood or obligation, it is about showing up for each other with respect and love." I wiped away tears as the room erupted in applause. But the words that stayed with me weren't from the toast. They were from earlier that day, when David had found me in the bakery kitchen early that morning, putting the finishing touches on their cake. "Mom," he had said, "I know I can never fully make up for what I did to you, but I want you to know that watching you build this life, this business, this community, it has taught me more about strength and grace than anything else ever could." That evening, after the wedding guests had gone home and the dishes were cleaned, I sat on the small porch behind Second Rise, looking up at the stars that were so much brighter in the mountains than they had ever been in town. Walter's presence felt close that night, not as grief, but as gratitude. He had known this day would come. He had prepared me for it with his love, his support, and his quiet insistence that I remember my own worth. I thought about the woman who had stood on that mountain road 18 months earlier, abandoned and heartbroken, convinced that her life was over. She couldn't have imagined this moment. A thriving business, a rebuilt relationship with her son, a community that valued her contributions, and most importantly, a deep sense of peace with who she had become. The abandonment hadn't broken me. It had freed me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, to build something entirely my own, to learn that love without respect is just another form of captivity. If you are listening to this story and you recognize yourself in that abandoned woman, if someone has tried to convince you that you are too old, too difficult, too set in your ways to start over, I want you to hear this clearly. They are wrong. You are not finished. You are not expired. You are not a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. You are a woman with decades of wisdom, strength forged in countless fires, and the capacity to build something beautiful from whatever pieces remain. The people who cannot see your worth, who treat your experience as inconvenience and your needs as negotiable, they are telling you everything about their limitations and nothing about your value. Don't let their blindness cloud your vision of what is possible. Second, Rise is more than just a bakery now. It is proof that it is never too late to rise again, to create something meaningful, to matter in ways you never imagined. Every morning, when I unlock those doors and begin the work I love, I am reminded that the best chapters of our lives might be the ones we write after everyone else has counted us out. Your second rise is waiting. You just have to be brave enough to begin.